At the hospital, Kim Dan sat in the examination room while Jo Jae-kyung sat to the side, beside Kim Dan, arms crossed. The doctor spoke, and as her words sank in, Kim Dan tensed. His eyes widened in shock. "Really?" he asked, disbelief clear in his voice. Jo Jae-kyung furrowed his brows, watching him closely. Kim Dan, however, remained silent. His expression said it all. It was not good news. The doctor explained that Kim Dan's condition was serious, mentioning issues ranging from insomnia to alcohol dependence. She warned that if his sleepwalking was left untreated, it could lead to dangerous situations or even serious accidents. "For now," she continued, "you should come in at least once a week or even on weekends to collect your medication and monitor your condition." Kim Dan, exhausted and with dark circles under his eyes, barely reacted. "Going forward, you will need regular treatment," she added. At the parking lot, Jo Jae-kyung turned to him. "You heard what she said about your condition, right?" Kim Dan remained silent. The doctor had emphasized something crucial. He should not sleep alone. "As his guardian," she said to Jo Jae-kyung, "you should stay by his side to keep an eye on him." Kim Dan frowned. "You don't have to go to such lengths for me. Besides, what concern is it of yours? I can take care of myself." Jo Jae-kyung's expression hardened. "Then who's going to watch over you while you're asleep? Your elderly landlord? Your grandmother?" Kim Dan had no answer. "Like how you'll take care of yourself," Jo Jae-kyung continued. "You've been neglecting your health all this time." He then warned him, "You'd better not skip any checkups. You're no use to me in this condition." Kim Dan fell silent, realizing Jo Jae-kyung's concern was not genuine, but purely selfish. His expression darkened. "I see," he muttered. "Now I understand. You're only doing this for yourself." Without another word, he turned toward the door. "I'm going to head out. Open the door, please." Jo Jae-kyung narrowed his eyes. "Where are you going?" "Home." "Do you have any money?" Jo Jae-kyung asked. "You didn't even bring your wallet with you." Kim Dan scowled. "I'll figure it out. Just hurry up and open the door." He clearly wanted to leave as soon as possible after what Jo Jae-kyung had just said. Jo Jae-kyung exhaled sharply. "Hey, you can just crash in my place. It's late anyway." Kim Dan hesitated. He started sweating, feeling anxious. "I'm not going back there." Jo Jae-kyung's patience wore thin. "You just don't listen." Determined not to let him leave, he locked the doors and started driving. Kim Dan stiffened. "Where are we going? Where are you taking me?" Jo Jae-kyung ignored the question and, after a short drive, arrived at a hotel. He approached the receptionist. "Just to confirm." The room replied, "The only room we have available is a standard double bed. Does that work for you?" Jo Jae-kyung didn't hesitate. "That's fine." At least, he thought, he wasn't taking Kim Dan to his apartment. Once inside the hotel room, Jo Jae-kyung gestured toward the space. "You can spend the night here." Kim Dan stood near the door, uncertain. He eyed the single large bed in the room. "What about you, Mr. Jo?" "You heard the doctor." Jo Jae-kyung said flatly. "I can't let you sleep alone." Kim Dan swallowed, unsure of how to respond. Jo Jae-kyung didn't wait for a reply. "I call dibs on the shower," he announced, and disappeared into the bathroom. Left alone, Kim Dan stepped into the shower, the warm water cascading over him like a gentle embrace. But instead of solace, his heart felt heavy, burdened by the weight of recent revelations. He had always brushed off his struggles, convinced they were mere nightmares brought on by stress and fatigue. Yet now, as he stood surrounded by steam and solitude, he was confronted with the stark reality that those experiences had names, diagnoses that turned his pain into something tangible and real. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, both liberating and terrifying. "I need treatment, but what's the use? It doesn't change anything." His thoughts wandered to Jo Jae-kyung. Why is he going to all this trouble for me? He quickly shook his head. It has to be that. Meanwhile, Jo Jae-kyung finished his shower and stepped out of the bathroom. He grabbed his phone and made a call. "Kyung, how did it go?" his coach asked. Jo Jae-kyung's tone was impatient. "Still nothing? Is the MFC actually doing anything? Tell them to hurry up." He ended the call and turned back toward Kim Dan, only to see him drinking. Jo Jaekyung's jaw clenched. He stormed over and snatched the bottle from his hands. "Are you crazy?" he snapped. "The doctor told you not to drink." Kim Dan slumped against the wall, unfazed. "I can't sleep if I don't drink." His voice was quiet, detached. Jo Jaekyung frowned. "That bottle is expensive, right?" Kim Dan muttered, assuming Jo Jaekyung was only upset about the cost. "Just add it to my tab." Jo Jaekyung's frustration deepened. "What?" Kim Dan continued, his words slurred. "Go ahead. Tack today's hospital bill, gas money, and the hotel room onto my debt, too. It's not like you're doing this out of the kindness of your heart." Jo Jaekyung's grip on the bottle tightened. "What the hell are you talking about?" Kim Dan chuckled bitterly. "You're only doing this to fix me, so you can go back to using me." Jo Jaekyung stiffened, but Kim Dan wasn't finished. "After all," Kim Dan continued, "I need a healthy body before I can pay you back in full." Jo Jaekyung inhaled sharply, his patience finally snapping. "For God's sake, I'm doing this because you can't even take basic care of yourself. And you're making everyone around you worry." Kim Dan scoffed. "And are you saying you brought me here because you're worried about me?" His voice was mocking, testing. Jo Jaekyung hesitated. Kim Dan smirked. "Yeah, that's what I thought." He exhaled sharply and leaned back. "My condition isn't as serious as you think," he muttered. "I'm just having trouble sleeping, that's all." Jo Jaekyung's brows knit together in disbelief as Kim Dan continued. "I can still do my job," Kim Dan said. "Everything below the waist still works fine. I won't have any problems working." Jo Jaekyung's stomach twisted at the implication. His expression darkened. "Are you out of your mind?" he demanded. "Are you even listening to yourself? Why the hell would you bring that up right now?" Kim Dan, ignoring his anger, moved closer. He knelt down in front of Jo Jaekyung and spoke in a low voice. "If I were to pay you back for today's expenses with my salary," he said, "it would take me months." His hands clenched into fists. "Let me settle up this way." Jo Jaekyung froze. Kim Dan lifted his gaze. His face was unreadable, his eyes distant. "I've already prepared myself." Jo Jaekyung's hands trembled. His chest tightened with something he couldn't define, anger, frustration, or something else entirely. Kim Dan, exhausted and lightheaded from the combination of alcohol and medication, suddenly swayed. His vision blurred, and he collapsed forward, his body pressing against Jo Jaekyung's. Jo Jaekyung caught him instinctively, but his entire body was rigid. Kim Dan's breathing was uneven. His grip on Jo Jaekyung's shirt was weak, but he didn't let go. Jo Jaekyung's voice was low, almost a growl. "You've got to be kidding me." Kim Dan didn't respond. His body had gone completely limp. Jo Jaekyung hesitated, his mind racing. "Don't pass out," he muttered, slapping him lightly. "You have a debt to settle, remember?" Jo Jaekyung let out a sharp breath, frustration surging through him. His gaze lingered on the man in his arms, his mind clouded with thoughts he didn't want to acknowledge. For the first time, uncertainty crept into his expression. "Can we really let this go on like this?" he murmured to himself. The night stretched on in silence. He had always thought he had control over the situation, but now, for the first time, uncertainty crept into his mind. Kim Dan, exhausted, had finally succumbed to sleep. But at what cost? The reckless drinking, the self-destruction, the way he spoke about himself. It was clear that he had long given up on anything changing for the better. And Jo Jaekyung? His actions, his words, were they truly just about fixing his own problems? Or was there something more he refused to admit? Now, I want to hear from you all. What do you think about Jo Jaekyung's and Kim Dan's behavior? Do you think Jo Jaekyung is only acting for his own benefit, or is there something deeper behind his actions? And what about Kim Dan? Do you think he can ever break free from this cycle? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you're enjoying this story and want to see what happens next, don't forget to check out the other videos on the channel. Make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter. Stay tuned. We're just getting started.